Hi, welcome to a little introduction to the poem First Love by John Clare. This is a poem by one of England's perhaps most unjustly forgotten poets. He lived at the beginning of the 19th century, around the same time as Byron and Shelley, who were very famous poets of the Romantic movement. And yet he never achieved their fame, partly because he deliberately refused to conform to the conventions that his more famous contemporaries were establishing at the time, um, where they were reinventing the English language with the uh, dramatic intensity of Romanticism. John Clare preferred to hold to the language of the county of Northamptonshire, where he grew up. He rejected grammar and formal language, regarding it as an unnatural imposition on the way people speak and experience the world. And actually, a lot of his poems include dialect words from the part of the world where he grew up. He loved nature. For him, the natural world was the place where he could be free. He found it difficult to relate to the people around him. He was uneducated, or at least had very little formal education, um, compared to Byron and Shelley, who had very impressive education at Eton and Oxford. And he, in fact, at one stage in his life, suffered a nervous breakdown, was confined to a mental institution, um, and there wrote some very moving poetry about the experience of being completely forgotten, becoming nothing in the eyes of your friends and your family. This poem is rather different. It's an exploration of love and the experience of meeting someone who completely captivates you from the very, very first glance. It begins with 4 lines of conventional love poetry. Um, the first word, I, places the speaker in the poem at the very heart of this experience. And we have this series of beautiful images, love being sudden and sweet, faces likened in the simile to a sweet flower, and the image of a heart being stolen away is presented, I think, in a way that one would recognize from a lot of love poetry as perhaps actually being a desirable or positive experience. What surprises us, though, is how that first stanza changes. His face turns pale. He loses the ability to control his body, and instead of the glance of his beloved bringing life, it brings sickness. And in fact, the stanza ends with an image of death. Clay is, of course, in the Bible, what God fashioned man out of. And the image of clay stands as a symbol for the human body before it's been given life. It's an image of death, which contrasts very strongly with the imagery of spring, of new life that dominate those first 4 lines. The poem goes on to, in the second stanza, change of focus. Whereas the first stanza has narrated the experience of meeting the beloved for the first time, the second stanza is a sudden onrush of physical sensations, blood rushing to his face. He loses his vision. We imagine it's almost like a feeling of fainting here. Bright daylight is transformed into dark nighttime. He loses even the ability to see. In fact, he loses the ability to speak. Words from my eyes did start, not words from his mouth, but from his eyes. He loses the ability to communicate, which for a poet is kind of a big deal. And we end that second stanza with a very dramatic image of blood burning around my heart. The final stanza is a series of questions and offers us a surprisingly introspective, cool ending to a poem which began with such a conventional expression of romantic desire. And the poem ends with a a sense that actually the heart being stolen away is not a wonderful experience of romantic love, but of loss and of emptiness. So let's go back and look at some of the language in a little bit more detail. As we said, the poem begins with the word I. It's a powerful sense of the speaker placing himself and his own experience at the heart of this poem. Note how the first 4 lines of the poem, you can see here as I indicate, are actually all one sentence. There's a sense of confidence almost here, of sort of completeness about this experience. We've got the enjambment between the first 2 lines out there. Was struck before that hour with love so sudden and so sweet. The use of the very musical, very gentle alliteration of the so sudden, so sweet here in the second line. And we got a repetition of that word sweet, haven't we, in the third line to really reinforce this image of female beauty. The simile of blooming like a sweet flower introduces this idea of springtime to the poem. The flower, of course, being a sense of life, promise, beauty, but also strongly associated with desire. And then we have the conclusion of the first 4 lines of the poem, stole my heart away complete. This is all written in tetrameter verse. That means there's 4 pairs of syllables in each line. So Eimer was struck before that hour. It's in what we call iambic tetrameter verse. And it, I suppose, gives us a sense of strength, of completeness in these pairs of line. Notice how we've got this AB, AB rhyme scheme here, again giving it a sense of musicality to it. However, where we began the poem with this single sentence in 4 lines, we then find that the second half of the first stanza changes. We've got the use of anaphora here, my face, my legs. I find it interesting that we've gone from I, first person pronoun at the beginning of the poem, to my, where the speaker seems almost disembodied. Rather than I, the sense of self, of being completely at one with yourself, he feels disconnected from his face, from his legs. My face turned pale as deadly pale. Again, that use of alliteration to emphasize the word pale, contrasting strongly with the image of sweetness from up here. My legs refused to walk away, further developing this idea of disembodiment. And all of a sudden, a question. We have here a 4-line statement of complete thought. When she looked, what could I ail? All of a sudden, sickness is brought by the glance of the beloved. As we've said before, my life and all, yet again an image of disembodiment, disconnection, seemed turned to clay. Not only clay, of course, being images of coldness, of heaviness. It's hard to think of something in the natural world that would contrast more strongly with the beauty of a flower than the heaviness of clay. We could also contrast, couldn't we, the thick, heavy consonant clay at the beginning of that word with the delicate musicality of so sudden, so sweet. Interestingly, my life and all, its complete existence here, has been destroyed by this moment. As we said, the second stanza marks a change in the focus of the poem to the physical sensation of the experience. And we've got this use of polysyndeton. Here we are. Polysyndeton means the use of repeated conjunctions, very often in the form of and, to introduce and link clauses. It creates a sense of rushing restlessness and energy, and then my blood rushed to my face and took my eyesight quite away. Again, this repetition of the word my, perhaps further developing the sense of disconnection from his own body, certainly being out of control of his experience. And then we find that the trees and bushes are introduced, contrasting here with this sweet flower imagery in the third line, this very gothic imagery of seeing midnight at noonday. Again, an image of death to recall the image of clay that ended the first stanza. It's been said I could not see a single thing. Is an interesting image here that's worth exploring. On the one hand, it's an image of blindness, isn't it? But some people have said that it's a sense I couldn't see a single thing. But this is a vision that's confusing. His vision has become words. That his, in fact, eyes, which normally are a means of receiving light, his eyes become a means of communicating. His eyes actually, words from my eyes did start. So it's a complete transformation of physical existence here. His eyes speak, as we said before. This image of words being communicated from his eyes rather than from his mouth is a sense of the poet in this poem losing his ability as a poet to communicate with words. The penultimate line of the second stanza, chords from the strings, musical instruments. I think here the suggestion is that Clare is drawing on the idea that with musical instruments we experience an idea of an emotion rather than a thought. We feel something when we hear a powerful chord played by a musical instrument, but we couldn't say that it communicates in the same way as words. And then this terrifying image at the end of the second stanza, blood burnt round my heart. Look at this heavy alliteration of blood burnt here, and this again, apocalyptic imagery, drawing on the imagery of death, this rather gothic imagery of trees and bushes from the middle of the second stanza. Worth noting the metre of the poem has changed by this point. We've got now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 syllables here. By the end of the poem, we've changed from tetrameter every line to what we call ballad form, which is alternating lines of tetrameter, 4 pairs of syllables, to trimeter, which is 3 pairs of syllables. And I think that goes a long way to emphasizing the hesitancy, the frailty of the voice. Forget that first sentence of the poem covered 4 lines. By the end of the poem, we've got 2 questions in the first 2 lines of the final stanza. Are is contrasting strongly with the I never was of the first 3 words of the poem. Note also this image of she seemed to, contrasting with the powerful verbs of burning, speaking, starting, rushing of the second stanza. Doubt is at the heart of this word here. We can also contrast the powerful consonants, the plosives of blood burnt round my heart, with she seems to hear my silent voice. There's a softness. There are almost no hard consonants in this line at all, really conveying the emptiness of the experience that the poet has gone through here. And certainly she hears my silent voice and not the understanding of actually what his love meant at this point. He hasn't been able to communicate what he feels. These 2 images here, just to take our attention back to them, are images of impossibility. Why does a winter choose flowers? Because flowers cannot exist in winter. Love cannot exist in snow. I think this is representing the poet's sense of futility, of the pointlessness of loving someone to whom he cannot communicate his love. He can communicate passion, but not an idea. And his emotional state is too strong to actually allow him to communicate anything meaningful. So let's get back to the final stanza here. I never saw so sweet a face. Recalls first line of the poem, I never was struck. However, where that first 4 lines of the poem represent a very conventional image of love and desire and attraction, we end with shorter lines and a sense of hesitancy. I never saw so sweet a face as that I stood before. My heart has left its dwelling place and can let return no more. There is an epigrammatic quality to these last 2 lines, that instead of romantic love and desire being something of affirmation and of joy, it's a note of sadness that we end on. The I never saw so sweet a face. It's interesting how we've got the same syllables, the same sounds and consonants, soft consonants being used as we have at the beginning of the poem. But in this line here, of that I stood before, the verb stood, of course, is motionless. There's a sense of helplessness about it. Simply to stand before something means you're not doing anything. You're not talking to, not communicating, not interacting with, merely standing before. And to return to that word my, which was so important, wasn't it, back in the early part of the poem? A disconnection, disembodiment dominates these last 2 lines. And perhaps, sorry, it's my cat's having a fight. And I think that's not this image of a dwelling place. To dwell somewhere is not to live, is not to exist, it's to be somewhere for a short period of time. And it's a rather powerful image of the transitory, brief nature of human life, which was emphasized in Turn to Clay. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this poem in the lesson very soon.